stream. Make sure that it's... Oh, that's not right at all. Channel. There it is. Well, that's just showing up. That's not what I want. Where's my studio? And go live. There it is. Which means I guess if it's live on my channel, then it's live, period. Okay, cool. Righto. And then it did it again. Okay. So, we ended at the very start of chapter 6, which if we, that's not a good way to put it, when we finish this chapter, that will be the next test. So, this chapter is a little bit longer than the other chapters. It's a little bit more dense because, I mean, it's the entire Revolutionary War, and if we go back to the title card, it's not an especially short war, although those last couple of years are just like negotiations. So we got a lot to talk about. So yeah, probably after today I'll put the PowerPoint up on Blackboard and the study guide just so you guys will have it. But again, we won't be finishing this until at least next week. So you guys don't have to worry about a test coming up anytime soon. Also, since we've turned the first paper in, the last paper, which isn't due until the end of the semester, so for this class is December 2nd or 3rd. It's that Monday that we come in, and then the rest of that week is finals week. That's on the default topic is just pick somebody that you think's interesting during the Revolution and what they did during the Revolution. So again, if you want to talk about George Washington, I don't want a biography. Just specifically what he did during the Revolution. There's a lot of interesting folk that aren't major generals or even politicians. For the lesser known people, you can definitely give me a little bit more about their life, since it's still a 2 to 3 page paper, double spaced. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So, yeah, but again, that's not due until the end of the semester. And then if you want to do something besides that, you can go into the Civil War, from this point now, the Revolutionary War, until the Civil War, which I don't know if we're going to get that far due to some delays we've had this semester already. So let's just see what happens. All right. So, anything before we start? Okay, cool. Right. Well, we ended here. Let me get. Only have. Oh, there you are. The March towards Lexington and Concord, Paul Revere, all of that, and then eventually the Battle of Bunker Hill. Both events, the British were technically victorious, but also both events, the colonists, the Continentals as they'll eventually be called, this is, again, well before we had any kind of unified American identity, did a lot of damage to the British that they were not expecting. This was the massive and powerful British Empire against what they expected to be at most some backwoods bumpkins that could potentially shoot back, but not the relatively well organized militias we had. So again, Paul Revere, Silversmith when he's not riding around yelling at people. And your Minutemen. Your actual Minutemen. And then Bunker Hill. Right. So, with the Battle of Bunker Hill, and again, technically a loss for the colonies, but again, they ran out of ammo, so like they fought until they couldn't fight anymore. I'd say that's pretty good for them. Convinced the Continental Congress to establish a proper army. It would, of course, be led by Brigadier General George Washington, surprising no one. He was like one of the few military officers from the 7 Years' War who hadn't died during the 7 Years' War. Remember, it seems like every military commander from that war tended to get himself killed in the said war. Now, that said, the Continental Congress wasn't an official government, so they couldn't demand a draft. They couldn't tell people to join the army. They didn't have any power of... They didn't have any legal power. I mean, I was going to say they didn't have any power of coercion. They didn't have any legal power whatsoever. So it was really just Washington going around asking the local militias to help out if they would like to, and asking the colonies to chip in and help with supplies and money and whatnot. And really, most of his time was just getting his soldiers to work together or even to work at all. I know I've said this a couple of times already, but Washington's biggest strength was his ability to get his men to work with him, especially as we're going to see here in a couple of slides. There was this very strong loyalty to one's individual colony. So when it came to like marching across colonial lines and helping other colonies, a lot of them just didn't feel like that was necessary. Oh, we've helped Boston, so New York can handle itself. He was able to inspire a great deal of loyalty, which is extremely important in keeping your army from either deserting entirely or stabbing you and leaving you in the middle of the road to die, which happened a lot in the past. So, again, not the best tactician. He tended to keep things simple, which worked. He wasn't doing anything crazy out there, but he did keep his army from deserting for the most part. So, that's what we needed. So, Washington and his boys had two major tasks right there at the start. Get the British out of Boston and keep the colonies from being attacked from the north, because the British had Canada under their control. And Canada didn't have enough population to really bother with, like, trying to rebel. They hadn't really been colonies long enough, and it didn't really matter to them what was going on in the American colonies. So, General Richard Montgomery and his troops captured Montreal, which, if you're not aware, is a Canadian city. Reinforcements that were supposed to be brought in by General Benedict Arnold were decimated by cold and smallpox, because, again, if you're not aware, it's cold up there, and also smallpox was still smallpox was a thing until really the last 100 years. so they weren't able to push the British out of Quebec and really Canada proper. So that's why we don't have a lot of Canadian territory anymore. We did attempt that again in 1812, but the British held on to Canada. Anyway, also Montgomery died. It's not really mentioned in the book, but I pulled the first picture I was able to find of General Montgomery was him being hauled off after the battle with a bullet in him. So, good work, Montgomery. So we weren't able to take Canada, but I guess we were able to kind of shore up our defenses there and keep Britain from invading from there. Not like they didn't already have access to all our ports, but whatever. However, during the winter of 75 to 76, General Henry Knox delivered weapons that were captured at Fort Ticonderoga. We mentioned that last slide. That was what Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys had helped to capture, and General Henry Knox was the one who helped to deliver said weapons to Washington's troops. Washington then set up these cannons on the hills around Boston and bombarded the hell out of the British. And the British are not known for enjoying being bombarded by cannon, so they left Boston. Turns out this happens again in France. Very similar situation, actually. The British had control of a port, and an artillery commander named Napoleon Bonaparte did a similar thing and took a bunch of cannons and set them up along the hills and started bombarding the British. We're like, we don't like this anymore. We're leaving. Because the thing about ships is they have cannons too, but they can't point up. So when you're getting hit like on top of the deck by cannons, it's time to leave. So there's Montgomery dying. Good work, Montgomery. I guess we had our martyrs too. This is how Washington dealt with the British in Boston, set up a bunch of cannons all along the hills around the city, and then just started blasting them from three sides. Eventually the British decided to get in their ships and leave, and apparently we had some, like, piratey ships out there, and they harassed the British on the way out. I don't exactly, I haven't been able to find much on that, but I don't doubt we had some amount of privateers wandering about. That's also how I play Fallout 4. If there's an area I want to deal with, I'll put a bunch of cannons around it first and then throw in an artillery grenade. You don't even have to fire a shot. Right. So we've got an army. We've got some proper fighting. We're getting the British out of Boston. However, there's still concern about exactly what's going on in the colonies. So there was this, I guess you'd say, event, this proclamation from Governor Dunmore. He was the governor of Virginia, the royal governor at the time. So he was the British appointed governor of Virginia. And the proclamation was that any slaves willing to fight for the British would be given freedom. Needless to say, this freaked out the Patriot leadership quite a bit, especially in the South, because while they were pushing for their own freedom, if they also allowed emancipation, this would greatly disrupt the plantation economy and also the whole social hierarchy of the day. It would have been too much too fast. Not to say if they had done it, that'd have been a heck of a thing. But they were trying to keep everyone together, and the southern colonies still barely agreed to independence to begin with. And that's where most of the economy was at the time. There were some colonists who wanted to negotiate a settlement with the British. However, the king and parliament, because again, a lot of the verbiage, especially coming from the Declaration of Independence, which we'll see in a little bit, specifies the king did this and the king did that, and the king didn't really do anything, because again, it's a constitutional monarchy at the time. So the king is equal to Parliament, if not weaker than Parliament at the time. So it was really the Parliament doing this. But for the sake of we're making a fresh break from a government, we made it seem that we were breaking from a pure monarchy into a representative democracy, as opposed to what was essentially a representative democracy, but also they had a king there for, executive powers. Anyway, point being, there were some colonists who tried to negotiate a settlement, but there was a prohibition against any negotiation or trade with the colonies because they were in rebellion. And therefore, a lot more of those who were trying to work something out just sort of had to rebel. A lot of the war could have been avoided if Parliament had been a little less heavy-handed. However, from Britain's point of view, this wasn't anything new. The British colonies have had little rebellions since Britain has had colonies. I've mentioned to the other class, Ireland rebels every 15 to 30 years. India, I don't know if India's had their big rebellion yet. I think theirs is maybe in the 1800s. They have this big old rebellion. India is way bigger than the American colonies. All Britain's little island nations, I'm sure they all have their own little rebellions. The colonies are rebellion, and if you have two British dudes on the street, and one of them says, the colonies are rebelling, the other one would say, which ones? Okay, and it wasn't a big deal. And they were harsh on the colonies because they felt like they just needed to be shown their place, get back in line, start paying your taxes, stop acting like you're better than the other colonies that we're making pay their taxes. So on the one hand, it seems like, if they had been a little bit, more understanding, it'd have been fine. But from the side of the British, this has happened before, and they don't see any reason to behave any differently. 1776, a pamphlet, written by Thomas Paine on his Common Sense, used arguments both from biblical stories and scientific analogies to essentially say independence was a good idea. Because technically, even though we had a Continental Army and we're like pushing the British out of Boston, the colonies have not officially declared independence yet. Because again, this is something that happened pretty often. This is just part of being British. Common Sense, though, was a bit of a game changer. Sold 120,000 copies in 3 months, debated and used to convince others to rebel, especially in taverns and coffee houses. These were the meeting places of the day. This is where the common folk would gather. And, well, I'll just use the quote from George Washington. Within weeks, George Washington himself wrote to a friend about the sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning contained, that's using the spelling back then, contained in Common Sense. So, I mean, the ideas behind rebelling and declaring independence were vast and complicated. I mean, that's why we're having a damn class on it. But Common Sense made it simpler. Common Sense made it so the average person could talk about it and see it as something that was important to them. Because honestly, it was more about the rich elites and how they could make more money off of America not being under British taxes anymore. But Common Sense made it seem like this was the common man's plight now. So colonies began taking control of their legislatures, pushing for independence. Congress sent an agent to France to request economic and military assistance. That will come up later. Now, initially, I had told my students that this was Benjamin Franklin. I don't think it actually was, because he actually comes up in like the next slide. So I'm not exactly sure who they sent to France. A lot of our founding fathers went back and forth to France. France was a big ally for us at the time. But we have to prove ourselves to them first. For the moment, we're just a bunch of scruffy colonists who are having an issue with England. And again, that wasn't uncommon. This isn't some big deal. You know, looking back, obviously it's some big deal. But at the time, it's just like, whatever. Cool. You're colonists that are pissy at England. Big Crimea River. So here's Common Sense, addressed to the inhabitants of America, written by an Englishman, Thomas Paine. Yeah, Thomas Paine wasn't an American colonist. He was an Englishman. He was from England. But he saw the issues of the colonists and saw that, they had a reason for independence. All right. So on to the big moment. So the fighting is just spreading. Just because we pushed the British out of Boston doesn't mean that the fighting has finished. And Common Sense spreading where the fighting wasn't happening, so people are becoming more and more aware of the need for independence, or at least the rationale for independence. Moderate delegates began to move towards independence as well. It wasn't just the radicals. Thomas Jefferson took the lead in preparing the Declaration. Uh, Now, the Declaration of Independence was not a was not an original document. It was not some new idea born of some divine inspiration that Thomas Jefferson came up with off the top of his head. It built upon many different ideas from all around the colonies. Use language common in local declarations in town meetings, county officials, colonial assemblies. For example, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, drafted by Mason, which is also mentioned right up here. Actually, don't need a point. I keep forgetting this is the online class. Yeah. All men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights. That sounds familiar. John Locke, he was an English, no, was it English or Scottish? I forget. He was a philosopher. Let me see. It's mentioned right here. John Locke. 17th century, so the previous 100 years, British philosopher John Locke argued that sovereignty resided in the people who submitted voluntarily to laws and authorities in exchange for protection of their life, liberty, and property. The people could therefore reconstitute or overthrow a government that abused its powers. So, again, it took these ideas that had already existed and put them together in a single, relatively short document. The Declaration of Independence is not very long. Let's see, were there any other... Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced the notion none of colonies are and right ought to be free and independent states, etc., etc. Yeah, so all these are summarized in the Declaration of Independence. You guys should at least know that. Now, needless to say, Jefferson's first draft was not the one we see today. It was debated for a while, revised by the various delegates there. They did agree upon certain verbiage, again, stating that the king excited domestic insurrections among us, particularly in regard to Dunmore's threat of freeing slaves. And again, as I said, they specified that it was the king that did this and not Parliament, because they were arguing against a monarchy and not a constitutional monarchy, which would have made things a little bit messier when it came to, breaking away and forming their own government. July 2nd, 1776, 12 colonies approved of the Declaration. New York abstained. New York remained kind of a loyalist stronghold until the very end. And it was formally declared on July 4th. The Declaration was published as a broadside, so basically like a billboard today, but back then way smaller. Just, it was like put up in towns, like on walls and stuff. Circulated throughout the colonies, which was technically treason, so we've now got ourselves a fight for survival. We're not just a bunch of uppity colonists. We have officially declared independence, and the British are going to be right pissed. Anyway, here's the folks doing the Declaration of Independence thing, as they do. Now, the book gives me different numbers, but the notes that I had before this, um, it wasn't like all the colonists all rose up together at the same time and fought against the British. It was about a third of the colonists were, you know, pushing for independence. About a third were loyalists, um, loyal to the British, and about a third were neutral and just wanted to stay out of the conflict altogether. The book says no more than half of the colonists actively supported, a fifth actively supported the British, and the rest tried to stay neutral. So, different numbers, but the point being, it wasn't, everybody in the colonies immediately rose up and fought the British. So we had different groups within the colonies who made their stances known very early on. White servants and black slaves of Virginia typically worked with the British because, again, they were offered freedom if they worked with the British, and that's a pretty good deal. Both sides also realized that the natives, despite their dwindling size or dwindling numbers, would still be very important in any North American conflicts. The British worked with the Mohawk tribe. Guy Johnson led that charge, and the Mohawk tribe was led largely by Joseph Brant, or Thandagea, I guess, as his actual Mohawk name. Continental Congress, with the work of Samuel Kirkland, did get some Oneida natives to work with them, but most tribes wanted to remain neutral because they saw what tended to happen to natives who worked with the European powers, which is to say they got put on the front lines and massacred. I've used the word loyalist a few times. If you weren't familiar with what that was, that's just the people that remain loyal to Britain. I feel like you probably would have gotten that by context by now. Keyboard? Hello? Click? What's going on? Oh, everything's frozen. Oh, there we go. Right. Continuing on. Loyalists were usually in the big cities. New York, Newport, Charleston. But it wasn't just the rich merchants who were loyalists. We also had a lot of people who fought for the British because their wealthy landlords worked for the side of the independents. So, if you're a poor tenant and you've been harshly treated by your landlord for generations at this point, honestly, and they're going to go work for the guys rebelling against the British, then you're going to want to work with the British. It's very enemy of my enemy situation here. Not quite, these guys are working for the British, so we're going to work with the French, but pretty close. And again, most of these guys figured that the British are going to win because, again, this is not something totally uncommon. A lot of natives, Mohawk, Seneca, and Cayuga in the north, and Cherokee and Creek in the south, also fought with the British because they fought for the British, I should say. Because, the British had set that proclamation line, had denied the settlers moving further westward, and they knew enough about the situation that if the colonists were to win this particular war, they would start moving west again. So, they were clearly clued into the political situation to know who they needed to work with. And finally, there were civilians caught in the middle. Um, if Patriot armies captured loyalist towns, um, the civilians were not safe from reprisals. Usually when we hear about, I guess what you would consider a war crime, during the Revolutionary War, it's all, oh, the British were so terrible, they did terrible things to our people. Like, yeah, well, it definitely went both ways. When the Patriots captured loyalist outposts and loyalist towns, they were not above, murdering women and children, or at least throwing them into the wilderness and letting the wolves get to them. So it worked both ways. So here we have some fighting out in the wilderness. Now, as I said, a fair number did prefer to stay neutral. Most native groups refused to remain attempted to remain neutral. Often were pushed to the side of the British because, well, as we're going to see, Americans are real good at massacring natives. For example, American soldiers killed the Shawnee Chief Cornstalk in 1777 under a flag of truce. Once again, something we're going to see a lot of, especially next semester when we start moving west. And we're like, oh, we're going to have a truce with you guys. Come to this this camp and we'll hang out. And then we shoot a bunch of people. It's unnerving how many times that happened. And obviously, if a tribe is trying to remain neutral and they're getting shot at by the American colonists, they're going to want to join the other side. There were also some colonists who tried to remain neutral, and obviously were seen as potentially spies or double agents from both sides. Quakers, Mennonites, Amish, Shakers, Moravians. It's the only time I ever talk about Moravian, and I'm not 100% sure if I'm saying that right. They wanted to remain neutral out of moral and religious reasons. Were often fined for refusing to pledge allegiance to new state governments. In 78, 9 Mennonite farmers were jailed in Pennsylvania, refusing to take an oath of allegiance. Their property and assets were sold, leaving their families destitute. You know, the good guys. Not to say the British wouldn't have done the same thing. But it's just that there's so much mythology around this war that it's like, oh, the Americans can do no wrong. George Washington once chopped down a cherry tree. It's like, come on, what? Now, it did go both ways because some of the religious organizations, especially the Quakers, were very, what's the word? Very serious, I guess you'd say, about their whole stance on neutrality. So if any of their members supported either side of the war, they'd kick them out. Now, while being kicked out of a potentially insular and very influential religious group could be very detrimental to like your social status in life. I feel like probably not as intense as like being sent to jail and having all your assets sold by the government. Anyway, one such Quaker was Betsy Ross, who is famous for sewing flags for the rebellion, and also her husband, who actually joined the rebellion itself. So there are some famous Quakers who joined the rebellion and got kicked out of the congregation. The Jehovah's Witnesses are the same way. They're very aggressively pacifist. So, like, if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you join the military, that you will be excommunicated. Or, what's the word? Disfellowship. And it's not that you just, like, can't go back to church. If your family is in the church, they're not allowed to talk to you or contact you or have anything to do with you. It's pretty, like, socially, it's pretty intense. It's pretty bad. I don't know if it was that way with the Quakers, but I know, like, at least modern day examples of that are pretty rough. Anyway, here's the Patriots having a calm talk with Cornstalk. As I mentioned to my Tuesday, Thursday class, I don't know what this guy sees, but Quaker lady detaining the English general. This is something we're going to see a little bit later. Because again, Quakers are neutral, so the British can just like roll in and have a chat and have dinner, and it's fine. She's totally not like keeping them there distracted while like she has some soldier friends come in to take care of things. Also, there's Betsy Ross and other people who apparently don't get names working on the flag. There's a whole mythos behind that too. All right. Bless you. So, once independence was formally declared, fighting for independence was now far more dangerous. Before, it was just, we're just having a little exchange of gunfire with the British. It's something that happens sometimes. Now, if you decided to properly fight against the British, it was an outright rebellion, and you'd be seen as a traitor. And if you're tried as a traitor, you get a short rope, and that's about the end of it. The British tended not to have long trials for that. Families of patriots also had a lot of work ahead of them. Some female patriots actually traveled along with the armies as support or fighting, which we'll talk more about later. There's a whole section on that, which is quite interesting. Most did stay home in support of the war from there. Northern women would increase cloth production. Southern women planted crops to increase food production, because with all these guys out doing the fighting, they're going to need clothing and food, and if there's nobody home to help make that, then they're going to run out of supplies real quick. Mary Freyer of Chester County, Pennsylvania, for example, known for collecting clothes from, her, I guess, neighborhood and surrounding area, um, mending those that needed to be repaired, and then sending them to nearby troops because, well, as we're going to see, um, Pennsylvania wasn't the best place to not have shoes. We also had Phyllis Wheatley of Boston. She was a freed slave that learned to read and write. She was a pretty can't speak, prolific poet. Um, Wrote a lot of poems to George Washington, urging him to recognize Africans as children of God. Essentially, hey, you're doing your own freedom thing. Maybe you could expand that a little bit. Some free blacks did work with the rebellion, seeing this as a um, means through which they could gain universal emancipation. It was this time of hope, I guess. There was this feeling of anything's possible. Most, however, remained enslaved in the South because that's just how things were at the time. And those who did have a choice typically worked with the British because the British actually had the means to give them freedom, and the British were 76. The British were phasing out slavery in the rest of the empire anyway. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and check that. I meant to check it last time, but I'll check it now. Come on. When did the British end, the slave trade? 1807. So, a good 60 years before America did. But they ended the transatlantic slave trade, so, as we're going to see in a couple of chapters, the North American colonies, the North American states now, couldn't get any slaves across the Atlantic because Britain had control of the ocean. But Britain was on the way to phasing out slavery already. So this idea of, hey, slaves, come and join the British and we'll free you, wasn't that radical to the British. There was already a pretty growing emancipation movement in Britain. Anyway, here's your typical household in the colonies at the time. Again, one entire wall was the hearth. You had everybody doing work except these two leeches. Part of the work was keeping said leeches out of the fire. I do like where it looks like that kid is just like eating syrup out of the jar. Ugh, children. Anyway. Here's a collection of Phyllis Wheatley's poetry, and history, poetry, ideals of the American Revolution, so bits on her life. I'm not sure about the title. Phyllis Wheatley Chooses Freedom. I get it has multiple meanings. The meaning they're going for is that she chose the American independence movement once she was granted her freedom, but it also sort of sounds like she was a slave and then decided one day, I want to be free, and then was? Like, I don't know. It feels weird. Like, in one way, it is a good title because she chose to work with the American Revolution, but also it don't quite work, at least from where I'm standing. Anyway, let's get on to the fighting, because we are having ourselves a war. So, as I had said before, uh, Washington moved out of Boston to attack the British on the way to New York City, but soldiers began to desert. Um, they felt that New York men should defend New York and Bostonians should stay in Boston. Which, I mean, almost feels like what would happen today. Freaking Bostonians, man. I've been to Boston once, and I never want to drive there again. If I ever visit Boston again, it's going to be like by train or something where I can just walk and then not ever have to drive. So after independence was declared, General Howe moved into the Hudson River Valley to separate New England and New York from the rest of the colonies, because New England and New York were like the major hotbed of revolution, and if he could keep them isolated from the rest of the colonies, he could keep the fervor from spreading. Also, another term here, the Hessians, the German troops, the German mercenaries, essentially, that were working with the British. Again, Germany didn't exist as a country yet. Prussia was really the main force of German nations, but there were a bunch of little principalities. But German-speaking people was still a large group. So that's what, when we say German, we just mean people from that region. So British Navy rolled in, Admiral Richard Howe, because again, nepotism isn't a thing in the British military. Continental forces were pushed back from Long Island, so the push into New York did not work out very well. They also took Fort Lee, New Jersey, and attacked Fort Washington north of New York City. It got so bad that the Continental Congress fled to Baltimore because they feared that Philadelphia will be hit next. So very, very quickly, well, I mean, over the course of, it was the summer into November, so over the course of a couple of months, it went from Washington trying to hit New York City to the Continental Congress is getting the hell out of Philadelphia because they're too close to what's going on. However, General Howe was not an especially aggressive general. He wanted to wear down the army and have the colonies plead for peace, because he believed that if he had been too aggressive, if he had been too willing to march through cities and burn places down, while it would have resulted in a quicker victory, it also would result in a defiant populace, so they would have had to station troops there and basically treat the place as an occupied region for who knows how long. If he could just engage the military, just engage the Continental Army, essentially grind them down and have the colonists sue for peace, then it would more or less go back to the way things were. And it would be an easier peace. General Howe was a pretty decent general. He saw things more as a politician than as just boots on the ground general. He saw how things could be way worse in the future if he did things a certain way. That said, he still had the British belief of, we're going to win anyway, so we might as well do it in a way that will make for a better victory in the end than victory, period. So if he had gone ahead and pushed, well, if he had gone ahead and pushed straight into Philadelphia, it wouldn't have mattered because the Continental Congress had left. But it does show that he was thinking ahead. Anyway, there's the New York campaign. Don't worry about the timeline here. Long story short, Washington got beat around for a couple of months and pushed out. There's the Hessians. You can tell by their hats and their mustaches. And then you see Fort Washington getting absolutely blasted by the British. Even a naval bombardment, which you never want to see that. Washington and his boys getting across the river to Fort Lee, and then Cornwallis rolling in from the north and then getting the hell out to go to South New Jersey after that. So it didn't go so well. It was just a whole lot of running retreats. All right, let's get just a little bit more and then we can call it for the day. So between July of 1776 and December, the Patriots had done nothing but get the crap kicked out of them and running. Again, though, in Washington's defense, his army was still together at least, which is more than you can say for most armies that get the tar beat out of them for 6 months. However, once again, Howe made things a little bit easier for Washington and did the old European tradition of not fighting over the course of the winter, because fighting during winter sucks. And in Europe, during the winter, you just build your little fort and hunker down and hang out. You don't fight during the winter. So the Continental forces could regroup, repair, recruit, make up for their losses, which I'm sure lots of people wanted to join up with the army during the winter after having heard about how bad they got their butts kicked over the course of the year. Camping in eastern Pennsylvania wasn't great. It was cold. They didn't have much supplies. We'll talk more about Valley Forge next time. However, Washington learned that Hessian troops were camping directly across the Delaware River in Trenton, New Jersey. So, Washington decided that rather than let's do the European thing and not fight during the winter, to make his way across the Delaware with 2,500 troops on Christmas Eve and hit the Hessian forces while they're all drunk and not expecting any kind of conflict. Because it's Christmas Eve, y'all. We didn't even fight on Christmas Eve in World War I. But no, he rolled in and beat on some drunk Hessians. I'm going to show you guys why the whole crossing the Delaware was really dangerous here in just a minute. I've got an image of that famous crossing. Usually it just shows him on the boat, but I've got the wider shot. And yeah, we about lost Washington that day. Marched to Princeton, engaging 3 regiments of regular British troops who were probably slightly less drunk than the Hessians. And by January of the next year, the British pulled out of New Jersey entirely and settled back into New York, where they would largely remain for the remainder of the war. And with New Jersey as the nice, comfy little buffer zone that it was, Continental Congress returned to Philadelphia. And while this wasn't some major tactical victory, it did show that the Continental forces were at least a force to be reckoned with. They weren't going to be running and getting the tar beat out of them at every turn. Now, this wasn't a super major victory yet. That comes later. We do have a very important battle next slide, but we'll talk about that next time. This does show both the British and the Americans, and this is going to be a long, rough war. Now, this is the famous image of Washington crossing the Delaware. What do you notice about this image that may be a problem for these little wooden boats? There are big ass chunks of ice in this water, and they are heavy. These are ice floes, essentially. One of those hits the boat wrong, and all these lads are going under the water. And you hit that water, and you're dead. I mean, that's cold water, and they're in, linens. So you're either going to sink or you're going to freeze before you really even catch your breath. Now, while this is obviously the famous boat, because it's got Washington and this guy dramatically holding the flag, look back here. There's some dudes with horses on their boat trying to get across this river with these chunks of ice hitting the boats and making awful noises. So, good luck to these guys. I mean, that's bravery. Here's the Hessians after they got their Christmas present. It's a wonder we got so many of our Christmas traditions from the Germans after we beat the crap out of them like that. Here's the boys going into Princeton. I don't know what's with the animal cruelty here. It's like, stop stabbing my horse. What are you doing? Washington's over here being dramatic while there's so much happening in the foreground. Dude over here is getting shanked. These guys are shot. They're on the other side of these cannons, so I guess they're like breaching the British lines. I don't know. There's so much going on. Yeah, so we'll talk about the year 1777 next time.